Hello and welcome. Thank you all for joining. We'll get started just about a minute or so after 1 o'clock Eastern. So hold tight. Hello and thank you for joining. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes, probably about a minute or so after 1 o'clock. Hello and welcome to the Trimarc webcast. We're going to get started at about a minute after 1 o'clock Eastern. Thank you for joining. Hello and welcome to the Trimarc webcast. We're going to get started in about a minute. Just going to let some other people join, and we'll get going from there. Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining this Trimarc webcast. I am Sean Metcalf. Just a quick note about Trimarc and what we do. We're a professional services company based out of Washington, D.C. We primarily perform security assessments for customers, which are comprehensive reviews of different environments. We provide detailed and actionable recommendations. And the key thing is this provides a roadmap to improve your security posture. So we have several security assessments that we perform for our customers, from Active Directory to Microsoft Office 365 and Azure Active Directory to VMware. So this is the first of our webcasts. We are very happy to have you join us today. So hopefully this will be a nice, smooth experience for everyone, including us on the Trimarc side. We will have another webcast in 2 weeks from today on May 27th. I will be presenting again on securing Office 365 and Azure Active Directory, defending your tenant. And then Several weeks later in the month of June, on June 17th, I will be doing another part of our Securing Active Directory webcast series, and it will be talking about performing your own Active Directory security review. You can register for these through the link at the bottom, trimarc.co/security webcasts. I believe that link is case sensitive, so please capitalize the S and the W in security webcast when going there. Or you can just go to trimarcsecurity.com. All right. Well, thank you all for being here. This is great. Hopefully you're doing all right on this lovely Wednesday. I am broadcasting to you from the Washington, D.C. area, so welcome to those that are joining from around the world. We saw a lot of registrations from time zones all over the world, so I appreciate you staying up late or getting up early to join us today. A couple of webcast admin notes. There will be Q&A after the presentation, so I have a lot of content to cover, but after the presentation, I'll be doing a Q&A. Please submit your questions. The moderators will review and publish the questions. You can like the questions that you want to hear answered. The most popular ones will be answered first, or to the best of my ability. Links to the slide and this webcast is being recorded. So the links and the recording will be posted to the Trimarc webcast page at trimarc.co/security webcasts in the next day or so. And like I said, I have a whole lot to discuss, so let's get started. This is the Trimarc webcast in the Securing Active Directory series, and I'm going to be talking about resolving common issues that we see when we do Active Directory security assessments. So there's a number of different areas that we identify in Active Directory that are problematic or concerning, and so I'm going to talk through a number of those today. And then in about a month, on June 17th, I'm going to talk in our next Securing Active Directory Trimarc webcast series. I'm going to talk about how you can perform your own Active Directory security review, showing you PowerShell commandlets you can run, what to expect from those, and how to resolve some of those common issues. And depending on how things come together, I may actually be able to publish that script that has all those commandlets together so that you'll be able to, or those PowerShell commands together so you'll be able to run it yourself and see how things look. So I am Sean Metcalf. I'm the founder of Trimarc. We are a professional services company based out of Washington, D.C. We help organizations better secure their Microsoft platform. So this is Active Directory, Microsoft Office 365, and Azure Active Directory, as well as a recent addition to our security assessment suite, which now includes VMware security reviews and assessments. I'm a Microsoft certified master in Active Directory and a Microsoft MVP. Currently, let's see if that stays, fingers crossed. And I've spoken at a number of conferences. I do a lot of security research, consult as part of Trimarc to customers, and I run adsecurity.org. So what's on the agenda today? We're going to be talking about the attacks against Active Directory, the common Active Directory security issues that we see at Trimarc when we do Active Directory security assessments, and challenges and frustrations that our customers have when they're trying to improve things. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of cloud integration security challenges. One I've talked about before, and then one that has been published but really isn't mentioned very often that could be a concern in some of your environments. So attackers require three things. They need an account, which are the credentials, the rights, which are the privileges, and the access, which is the connectivity to those resources. And ultimately, the attacker capability depends on the defender. As Jessica Payne says, you can build your own attacker's playground. So you have the ability on your home turf to basically control where attackers go, how they move around, and the tripwires that you can set up within that environment. One of the biggest concerns that people have is, well, the attacker would have to get domain admin, right, in order to do anything. No, not exactly. Domain admin is just part of a suite of permissions in Active Directory that provides access and privileges. Ultimately, there's a large number of avenues to compromise, so to speak, regarding permissions at the domain, DOUs, groups and accounts, and group policy objects, or GPOs, accounts that have a lot of permissions, such as service accounts, which are almost always over-permissioned, to Kerberos delegation, to password vaults that end up getting delegated a lot of rights to control their access, and now it's another control plane to Active Directory itself. And then the backups. Where are the backups of Active Directory actually occurring? Where are they getting stored? How are they getting managed? And what are the accounts associated with that? So attackers, when they first get into the environment, they're going to perform some recon. They're going to look around, see what they can find. It often starts with the local workstation, the system that they drop onto, and one of the first things they're going to check is to see, elevate and check to see what the local admin password hash is and pull the password if possible. With this, they're going to spread out and see if they can move laterally in the environment with that same username and password or that password hash. If they can, then they can move around and really identify what sort of services, service counts are being used in the environment, where admins are logging on, different accounts that have different types of access, and just start building a database full of privilege rights and access. So one of the best ways to resolve this issue is to ensure that this local admin password changes automatically, and something like Microsoft Local Admin Password Solution, or LAPS, works very well in this. We have a number of customers that have used this, including customers that have 140,000 workstations distributed around the world, and it works pretty easy. We call this the easy button for resolving local admin passwords. Now, of course, you can also layer on top of that some group policy in order to limit the local account's ability to connect remotely to other systems, which is recommended as well. But this is really the first step in limiting what the attacker is able to do. Then the attacker is going to do some recon against Active Directory, probably using a tool such as PowerView or the .NET equivalent, and identify who are domain admins. Or looking for accounts that have admin count set to 1. These are accounts that are highly privileged, but may not necessarily be in domain admin specifically. They will also probably look to see what rights are distributed via group policy. So these are the groups in Active Directory that are added to the local administrative groups on workstations or computers or servers in the environment. This is done through group policy, either through group policy preferences or through restricted groups. And PowerView has a easy function here called Find GPO Computer Admin, which allows you to target a specific OU and then see what AD group actually has what rights on there. So we see there's a workstation admins group here that's being added to the local administrators group. And when we do a getNet computer against this OU, we can get a list of the computers that this group is going to have admin rights on. But sometimes computers actually have admin rights. So the computer accounts that are in Active Directory end up with privileges themselves because they're a member of a specific group. So in this situation, we see that there are at least 2 computers that we can see here, a Win10 and a Win7 computer objects, and they're members of the Workstation Admins group. This Workstation Admins group, as we saw previously, has full admin rights to all the computers. So if an attacker drops onto one of these computers or is able to move over to one of them and gain admin rights on it, they can leverage that computer account to then have full admin rights on all the workstations in the environment. Old passwords. I'm not sure how good your passwords were in 2005, but I'm pretty sure mine were pretty horrible. Accounts with old passwords are definitely at risk. There's attack methods that are being used, like password spray and Kerberoast style attacks, that provide the capability for the attacker to scan the environment, get some information, and with password spraying, which I'll cover in a little bit, test the password and then see if that works for the user. That's time consuming and takes a while. Or if the account has an associated service principal name or SPIN, then the attacker just needs to Kerberoast. And I'll talk more about what that actually is, but it's effectively an offline password attack using a Kerberoast service ticket that is requested as a regular user. So we do find that probably about 20% of the time or so, the default domain administrator account in the environment actually has an associated Kerberoast service principal name or SPIN. There's no good reason for them to have this. This is usually because the AD environment has been around since the beginning of Active Directory in around 2000, 2001 or so. And then a few years after that, the person who's running the environment, which may be the only person, the only AD admin, is told, hey, we need to spin up a SQL server. Well, I'm the only person here, so I'm going to go ahead and spin up that SQL server using the default domain administrator account because everything's going to work, and I know it's going to work just fine. But it shouldn't. It's not used for that. KRBTGT. The KRBTGT account is effectively the Kerberoast service account for the Active Directory domain. It's disabled, but it's used to sign and encrypt Kerberoast tickets. This password is typically not set. It pretty much never changes except after its initial creation, and oftentimes when upgrading from an older version of the operating system to 2008 R2, 2012 R2, things like that. We can see in the screenshot here that this KRBTGT account was created in January 9th, 2019, and the password last set date is the exact same. This means it's never changed since the AD environment was created. This also means that every Active Directory backup that's occurred in this environment for the past year captures this KRBTGT account password. And any compromise of any of those backups going back to the first one could result in a full compromise of this environment due to a golden ticket attack, which takes the KRBTGT account password hash that would be discovered through, in this case, an Active Directory backup, and could leverage that to create Kerberoast tickets that basically say, I'm anyone I want to be. I'm a domain admin, I'm an enterprise admin, whatever they want. It's also interesting to note, I discovered a few years ago that this MSDS key version number attribute actually tracks every time the password is changed for security principles in Active Directory. This is for Kerberoast reasons, and the KRBTGT starts with this key version number set to 2, and every time it changes, it typically increments by 1. We have seen some weird scenarios where it was like 1005. I seriously doubt the environment changed it over 1,000 times, especially in that environment, but typically increments by 1. So if the creation date is 2005, and the password last set was 2015, and this key version number is 5 or 6, let's say it's 6, that means it's changed 4 times during that time at some point along the way. Most of the environments we see have had this password change once because of the fact that they've upgraded to 2008 R2 or 2012 R2 or something like that. The other way that an attacker could get this account is by gaining privileged rights in the environment, and then pulling the KRBTGT account password hash. They can get the current one and the old one because the KRBTGT stores the current password and the previous password. Both of these are valid. So this means that even if you have changed your KRBTGT once, let's say in the past 5 years, and your AD environment is 5 years old, every Active Directory backup that has been performed for those past 5 years stores the KRBTGT account password hash. An exposed backup would result in the compromise of this environment through a golden ticket. So the mitigation, the U.S. Department of Defense STIG requirement is that this password has changed 2 times every year because of the fact that this password actually is stored twice, the current one and the previous one. If you only change it once, the current password gets moved over into the previous password slot on the account, and of course it has the new password in the current password slot. But that previous password can still be used for Kerberoast tickets and thus golden tickets. I have a link here at the bottom of where you can go to actually reset this password, the KRBTGT account password, using a Microsoft script that they provided. And it might actually also be possible to pull the KRBTGT service ticket or service ticket for the KRBTGT account and then Kerberoast it. Matt Nelson with SpectreOps identified that in one environment, this was set to a 3-character password. So if your KRBTGT account has not changed since it was first set up in 2000 or 2003, there may be an issue where it could have been set to a known value, and the process by which it changes to a 16-character random password, which should be happening on modern operating systems, did not. So be aware of that. Service counts and domain admins. This happens a lot, that service counts are frequently over permission. This way they just work. We often find there are a lot of service counts and domain admins, and one of the things we do as part of our Active Directory security assessment is going through and helping to figure out how to reduce the rights of these service counts. Attackers are going to look at domain admins, they're going to look at these privileged groups and figure out and find what accounts are in these groups. Then the other thing they may do is something I call spin scanning, which is you scan the environment looking for Kerberoast service principal names. That way you can identify the type of enterprise applications that are available in the environment, as well as the associated service accounts. Because if I can determine that SQL is running in the environment and discover those SQL service accounts, I can map those to specific servers. If I can compromise one of those servers, I can compromise that service account. And if that SQL service account, which if it's a member of domain admins, which it absolutely should not be, but we found that it is in some environments, if we can get onto that server, we can use something like Mimikatz and then dump those credentials from LSASS. This includes the accounts that are logged on interactively, such as at the console or via RDP, as well as running those running service account credentials. So those services that are running under the context of a specific service account. So that shows up in Mimikatz. So know that when you have a service account running on a system, that information gets loaded into, that credential information gets loaded into LSASS, into memory. And if an attacker gets privileged rights, admin rights, or system rights on that computer, they can pull this information through Mimikatz. But they don't need to only use Mimikatz. So looking for Mimikatz is a zero-sum game. It's not going to solve the problem, because ultimately anyone with admin rights can just open up the Windows Task Manager, right-click on lsas.exe, create a dump file, and then use that dump file, copy it offline somewhere else, and then use Mimikatz to extract the information from the dump file, which is the same thing you would get just like as if you ran Mimikatz directly against the system. There's also PowerShell create mini dump and a couple other ways. More recently, someone figured out the specific DLL that this GUI is calling and figured out how to call that directly in order to create a command that would then dump it, which I've done as well. It's actually very simple to do. So we have these service accounts. These are these user accounts, and the passwords really never change on them. That's a problem. So Microsoft said, you know what? We're going to come out with this thing called managed service accounts, but those only work for a specific one server. So we're going to improve that and call it group managed service accounts. So now you can have a group managed service account and have it run services on many different computers in the environment. A few things have to be set up for this because Active Directory is now managing that password. That also means that each of these computers that need to run services under the context of this GMSA need to know what the clear text password is to actually start that service and get it running. So the password is managed by AD. Now the computer needs to be able to request the password for that GMSA to start that service when that service starts. This introduces a couple of concerns. One, if an attacker compromises the computer, then they can compromise the GMSA. Or if the attacker compromises an account with rights to request that password, then they can compromise that GMSA. So let's take a look at an example of a group managed service account in an environment. This is similar to what we've seen in the live, so in the world. So this is not too far of a stretch. So we have a GMSA here called SVC Lab GMSA 1. This GMSA is a member of the Domain Administrators Group, which has full AD and DC admin rights to the domain, which is a bad idea right off the bat. It's also a member of server operators and print operators, which means that it has some other rights. Even if we remove it from administrators, it would have the ability to log on interactively to domain controller, as well as some other rights. So that's a red flag right away. We can see the password was last set on May 11th at 2:08 p.m. and the MSDS managed password interval, which is the password change frequency, is 30 days. So we have about 28 days to do something with this account if we can get the password for it. There are two service principal names. We see that there's an LCN SQL 01 server here, so that's going to be interesting. And there's also this principals allowed to retrieve managed password, and there's a group there. So we'll take a look at that also. So in this situation, we're going to go after the server itself. Can we get access to the server? We've identified this LCN SQL 01 server is registered as a service principal name on this GMSA. So this server object is in the server's OU. So if we can compromise an account with rights to that OU, or an account or group account that's in a group that's been delegated admin rights via group policy restricted rights or similar, or have the ability to modify a group policy that links to this OU, then we can get local admin rights on this server. So once we get admin rights on the server, we can run Mimikatz. We run Mimikatz against the server. We run our Securelsa logon passwords. We see there's a service here that's running under the context of this account, and it gives us some information. What's interesting about this is on this server, it's giving us a password, but the password is _SA_, and then there's a GUID. Well, that seems really weird. So what's interesting about a GMSA is while it loads this information, it doesn't really seem to use it, or at least that seems to be the current concept of what's happening here. So this isn't going to give us the information, and this NTLM password hash that's shown here is actually garbage. It's not the actual password hash. But if we use Mimikatz or Curlsa eKeys, we can get the correct NT password hash for this account. And then with that, we could actually use it, pass the hash, and then compromise AD because this GMSA is a member of the administrators group in the domain. But what if we couldn't get access to the server account itself? We know there's some principals with rights to the GMSA password, so let's take a look at that. So we see that there's a group here, service SVC lab GMSA 1 group. So we'll do an enumeration of that, and we see there's another group there. So we'll enumerate the membership of that group. It's server admins. So now we have a good feel for what accounts, what security principals, these are computers and users that would have the ability to pull the clear text password for this GMSA. So we look at this and we see that there's 11. That seems like a lot. And 9 of these look like regular user accounts because they're in OUs, branch office OUs. So all we have to do is compromise one of those and we compromise the GMSA account. And again, since it's a member of the administrators group in the domain, we can then own the domain. So we can use the standard Microsoft PowerShell command, like get-AD service account, and target the property msds-manage password. This is the clear text blob or password blob for that GMSA. We have to have rights to that through that attribute that we saw previously. But once we do, we can pull it. And then using a DS internals PowerShell module, we can convert this to an NT password hash. So this is the same password hash we saw in Mimikatz in a previous slide. And that's pretty interesting. So that is if we have access to an account that has the ability to pull the rights. If this account is actually a computer account, then what we need to do is something a little bit different. If the computer account where the server has the right to get the clear text password and we're on the server, we then have to elevate or change our context over to the system account. Here I'm using psexec, and then I can perform that same action in order to pull that password data and convert it to an NT password hash and then pass the hash. But I have to use system because that's what a system is, the account or context which interacts with Active Directory as the associated Active Directory computer account. And once I do that, then I can get the GMSA password. If I'm just a user, or even if I'm an admin on this system, I'm not going to be able to get that password hash data. And then here you can see that I'm confirming the NT password hash that the DS internals function provides, and it matches that's in Active Directory itself because I'm using DS internals to do something similar to a DC sync to get to replicate the account information and then confirm it and check it. Okay, so a lot of stuff going on there, but ultimately it comes down to service account domain admins is extremely problematic. If you have a vulnerability scanning account, this means that account is scanning everything. And it's probably one account domain admins that's scanning domain controllers and workstations and servers, which means that if that vulnerability scanning system hiccups or is using Kerberos and you have unconstrained delegation on a system in your environment, that credential could be left behind. And if that credential is left behind on a workstation or a server that's been compromised, then all of Active Directory is compromised. So we want to make sure that we limit and separate out the rights that we have for these different things and confirm that they need the rights. Just because the vendor says you need domain admins for the service account, say no. Say we don't do that. We don't give any service account domain admins. What are the rights you actually require? Through Trimarc, when we did a security assessment, we found that there was a major vendor that said they needed domain admins. We didn't think so. We reached out to the vendor and we got them to actually change their documentation. And so all that was required is the ability to add a new computer to that domain. So they were saying domain admins. They've changed that to account operators, but they said, well, Microsoft says don't use account operators. So really, you just need to delegate the ability to add a computer to the domain for this account. For GMSAs, you definitely don't want GMSAs or any service account that's a member of domain admins to be running on a server that's not considered tier 0 or the same protected level as a domain controller. So we want to limit that and prevent interactive logon capability for service accounts. This way, someone can't just log on interactively, log on to the console, log on via RDP as that account. So Active Directory permissions. This is a really big issue because while you may have accounts that are in these groups like domain admins and enterprise admins and schema admins and account operators and server operators, the problem is that ultimately you have to use this to manage permissions in Active Directory. And the person who was working there before you, because your AD environment is 10 to 15 years old, has set a whole bunch of permissions, you're not sure what they are. And looking at a screen like this, I have no idea what's going on. Managing and auditing these permissions in AD is very tough because this is what Microsoft has given us to manage it with. And you can't see easily that there's a major security issue here. Domain computers have full control. This is based on a real-world example that we discovered during an Active Directory security assessment. And this is a serious security issue. The attacker compromises any computer in the AD domain to compromise Active Directory because domain computers have full control at the domain level. So that's very bad. But we're not going to easily find this because we'd have to click through all these different pages. We'd have to look at the advanced auditing, advanced security permissions, and so on and so forth. But there is a way to do it through PowerShell and get a nice CSV that you can open up in Excel. And then you can filter on this. And I have the link here as well as at the end of the section. We can sort by organizational unit. We can look at the identity references or the security principles, look at the Active Directory rights. Generic all means full control. And then extended right or special rights such as DS replication, get changes, all get changes, things like that. So this is the way to dump it and look at it if you have an idea what you're looking at. But there is a tool called AC Lite that was published for free from the CyberArk research team, and it uses a Power View function to gather and report on the Active Directory permissions. In fact, it uses this exact function called invoke ACL scanner, which was originally used by Bloodhound in order to pull in the Active Directory permission information from the AD environment. And the nice thing about AC Lite is that it's going to pop up or provide these different text files which are reports highlighting potential issues. So all entities with extra permissions, account with extra permissions, these are things to look at to see what might be an issue in your environment. Now, of course, you can run Bloodhound and see what other security issues may be there. And Bloodhound is specific for pathing and figuring out via graph theory how to get from this specific computer or account over to domain admins or how to move around in the environment. So it's specific for that. And when we are doing Active Directory security assessments, we find security issues in domain permissions about 70% of the time. Again, this domain computers issue or server admins have high permissions or full control or the modify rights, which is right property, on computers in the environment. But the other thing that's interesting that isn't very obvious is permissions that are configured on admin SD holder. Admin SD holder is an object in the system container that holds the permission template for highly privileged AD objects like domain admins, enterprise admins, the KRBTGT account, and others like that. And about every hour, the PDC scans the highly privileged objects, removes the security inheritance that's configured on it, and applies these permissions, effectively stamps these permissions from the admin SD holder object right onto that object that it identified. Then it sets the admin count set to 1, which I had mentioned earlier. And this is never automatically changed from 1. This was an original design decision that was made by Microsoft. It's good that they didn't do that because now change it automatically once they fall out of compliance, because this means all the accounts that were in domain admins have admin count set to 1, even after they've been removed from domain admins, which means that the security inheritance is still turned off. So you need to turn the security inheritance back onto those so they can capture and inherit the permissions from the OU that they're now in. So when these permissions on the admin SD holder are set, they effectively flow down to highly privileged objects and remain there. So in this example on the screen, we have this user admins group that has modify rights to all objects and all attributes. So this means that any member of user admins is able to change passwords, modify groups for domain admins, enterprise admins, the highly privileged accounts in the environment. This is not a great way to do the delegation. There are better ways to do it. And you don't want non-domain admins being able to modify membership of domain admins or permissions on those objects, or potentially even change the password. So there's some issues around that. There's definitely better ways to do that. Microsoft Local Admin Password Solution, or LAPS, is a great solution to automatically change the computer local admin password. But the proper delegation of this access to the LAPS password, that is local admin password, is critical. So during Active Directory security assessments, we often find that too many accounts have access to the local admin password through LAPS. So when we go through and do our scan, we'll identify that there might be 100 accounts that actually have the rights to view the password through the LAPS system, which is effectively an attribute on the computer attribute. So the important thing here is that lapse delegation is a critical part. And often lapse password access is delegated, like I said, to a group or a series of groups. And then these groups have other groups and then have other accounts. And then ultimately it's almost everybody that has the ability to check out or view these passwords. So I have some references here on this slide on reviewing Active Directory permissions. This white paper on 80 ACLs or permissions by Andy Robbins and Will Schroeder are fantastic. From Black Hat 2017, it's on the SpectreOps site. Highly recommend you go and read that. It is very in-depth and heavy. So if you're sleepy, reading about 80 ACLs is a great way to make sure that you fall asleep. But the work they did is great and helps make it understandable and approachable. Password spray. You've probably heard about password spraying. In a nutshell, password spraying is when an attacker takes a list of passwords that they want to try in an environment like winter 2018, spring 2019. They're going to take this one password and they're going to attempt authentication as every user in the environment or every account that they care about in that Active Directory or that environment specifically. After they try one password, they're going to sleep for a certain amount of time and then they're going to try the next one. This is going to be based on the lockout policy in this environment. So if the lockout policy is 5 password attempts every 30 minutes, then they're going to do n-1, which would be 5 minus 1 is 4, and they're only going to do 4 in that 30-minute period, and then wait. Or if they're more careful than that, maybe they'll only try 2 or 3 to account for maybe the user trying a bad password or 2. But this is a very effective way to guess passwords. And my understanding is that there have been a couple of fairly large breaches that have occurred because passwords are bad like this and were discovered through password spraying or similar. And the domain password policy enables this. So shorter passwords means more effective password spraying. The Active Directory default is 7 characters. We often find that it's 8 or 10. And that means that it's still not that difficult because when you look at these passwords, winter is WINTER 2018 exclamation point. That's 11 characters. So technically, this is a good password because it meets the complexity requirement, but it's very easily guessable. So it's not just about necessarily having a password length that is 8 characters, 9 or 10. Certainly 12 or 15 makes it more difficult because then the range of what the password sprayer has to try, the attacker has to try, makes things more difficult. And events are going to show up. So the standard 4625, the account was unable to log on, failed to log on, is going to populate here, and it's going to show that this account attempted to log on and had either a bad username or a bad password. And then there's a last bad password attempt attribute that we can look at in AD to see who's last attempted or had bad password attempts, and we can do some correlation of that. What's interesting though is that if the password spray, the attacker changes password spray to use Kerberoast authentication, all of a sudden the 4625s no longer populate. Now we have to make sure that we have Kerberoast logging enabled, which is an advanced audit policy setting, which isn't always configured. We can see that this last bad password attempt still occurs. There's also a bad password count attribute that is stored per domain controller and is reset when the user successfully logs on. But you'd have to correlate across all the DCs to try to see like where that count is and if it's incrementing, which you might be able to do if you have a small number of DCs. But realistically, you could look for 4625s coming across the environment a lot at once, or 4771s with a failure code of 0 by 18. We published this information on Trimarc Security a couple of years ago, and I did a security conference talk a number of years ago about this, about how to detect this, and the fact that if you look at this failure code, which means bad password, then you can detect password spraying occurring in your environment in Active Directory. You can also, if you're pulling the endpoint logs, look for 4648s. This is a logon was attempted using explicit credentials. And this means that this one user, Joe user, is attempting to log on with explicit credentials for all these other users, for Alexis and Christopher and Cameron and Nicholas. And this means that something weird is going on because Joe is attempting to do all these authentications around the same time. So how to improve this? Like I said, we've seen customers go from the default of 7 to 8 which is not ideal. You definitely want this set to at least 12, preferably 15, because this forces users to use slightly better passwords or better creative methods of how to do their passwords. And maybe instead of spring 2019 exclamation point, it's spring pound 2019 exclamation point, or spring 2019 exclamation point 2. Or something along those lines. But better than that is the Azure Active Directory password protection, which is actually for your on-prem Active Directory. You do have to have Azure AD Premium 1 licensing for this. But if you do, this is a great way to prevent users from using bad passwords. This involves a password agent on your, a password protection agent on your domain controllers, which is effectively a password filter. Every so often, a list of passwords is downloaded, and then there's fuzzy logic that's used to determine a point value for the password the user's attempting to use versus the known bad password. So Microsoft may have password in that password list, and any kind of character substitution would automatically deny the user from changing that password to something like that. Password 123, 1234 would automatically be captured as well. Kerberoasting. So Kerberoasting is very interesting. Tim Medine came up with this concept a number of years ago and talked about it. First time I saw it was at DerbyCon a number of years ago. And it's very interesting because it takes advantage of the way that Kerberoast actually works. When a user wants to access an application via Kerberoast authentication, they are going to request that Kerberoast service principal name. So they're going to request MS SQL or whatever / the server name, and then oftentimes with SQL there's a colon with a port number or an instance name. Well, the application, the client app that's on the user's workstation is going to know that. It's going to say, you need a service ticket for this. The workstation is going to broker that request to the domain controller and say, here's my Kerberoast TGT, my proof of identity. I need a service ticket for this spin. The domain controller is going to look up an Active Directory, find that spin that's associated with that service count. As we talked about earlier, we have different service counts with different spins. Then what it's going to do is provide that service ticket, which is encrypted with the NTLM password hash if the Kerberoast encryption is RC4, or the AES password hash for that service count associated with that spin, if the ticket is using AES, which is common on modern networks. Key point and takeaway here is that the user is requesting these service tickets for this targeted service count that's associated with the server, but we never talk to the server. We don't need elevator rights, and we can do this as a regular user at any time we want to. I estimate that anywhere from 20 to 30 to 50 to 100 service tickets are requested by a user per day, just in a normal environment. Larger enterprises, obviously, it's going to be closer to 50 or 100 if they're very busy and connecting to a bunch of different systems. Smaller environments, maybe more like 20. But there's a lot of noise that happens here. And then as the attacker, all we need to do is run some PowerShell commands in order to get this data or request that service ticket. You can see here that the Kerb ticket encryption type is RC4 HMAC on the bottom part of the screenshot. That tells us that it's encrypted using that NTLM password hash. We can see what that spin is. It's MSSQL SVC / server name : 1433 standard SQL formatting. We have that service ticket. Now, as the attacker, we can take the service ticket, extract it from memory because this is in our user memory space. So if we're an attacker and we drop onto a user's computer, we phish them or whatever, we get into that computer, we can just do this activity. It's usually going to blend in. We're going to save that ticket offline, upload it somewhere, run it on our cracking rig. And then we have time, because how often do SQL service counts change? Pretty much never. So we have a year or two to try to crack this. And if the domain password length or minimum requirement is 8 characters, then it's probably going to be 8 characters. It might be 10, but it's probably going to be 8. So we can run through hybrid password crack on this to see what we can find. Hybrid password cracking is based on some password theory that means that most users are going to use a capital letter to start their password, a symbol at the end, usually an exclamation point, and they're going to pad whatever they like to use to meet that minimum password length. They can also use keyboard mapping or walking, which is like QWERTY 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That way they can hit the password minimum, but it's a common password pattern that they know. A lot of admins like to use this for service counts, for admin passwords. Attackers know this, so they've loaded these into their Kerberoasting dictionary files, into their password spraying files. So how do we detect this? Well, we've got to log Kerberoast authentication requests, specifically for service requests. and that results in this event ID 4769. I identified years ago that specific ticket options are used for Kerberoasting, as well as the ticket encryption 0x17. 0x17 is an RC4 ticket. These ticket options may vary now because there's a number of different tools that are doing this, but ticket encryption will always be 0x17. Now you need to filter out service counts, which are the account names, and computers as a service name. Also, Interforce tickets use RC4 unless configured to explicitly use AES or allow it. And ADFS often uses RC4. So there's some tuning that needs to be done in order to identify, okay, all of these things that are happening for these ticket requests, are they valid or not? But ultimately, an attacker is typically going to drop in, identify any of the accounts that have service principal names. These are the service counts, or maybe they're going to look for admin counts set to 1. They're going to go through, they're going to pull all the service tickets for these, make sure that they're RC4. And for detection, if we're monitoring 4769 using these key values, we can identify that there's something weird going on. Joe user, he was doing probably password spraying earlier, and now it looks like he's Kerberoasting, and it's all happening in the evening at around the same time. And he's pulling services for VDI, provisioning service, BizTalk, business objects, Microsoft Advanced Group Policy Management, a handful of SQL servers. This seems really weird and suspicious. But what if the attacker just tries one of these a day or one of these a week and then kicks it over to their Kerberoasting rig and just lets it run? This would be practically invisible in the environment unless you create a honeypot account. So we're going to create a honeypot account, set admin count set to 1, and we're just going to make up a service principal name because it doesn't have to be valid. So we're going to say it's a SQL service account on this honeypot server. I don't recommend you call it honeypot in any way, shape, or form. But we create it, and then now what we can do is when the attacker is getting the information of what to Kerberoast for, he's going to say service principal name is something, admin count is set to 1, Kerberoast honeypot, let's go after that. Hopefully the attacker doesn't look at the spin too carefully because it's definitely a trap. So they request the RC4 ticket, they get that, and now they're off to the races to try to crack that. The issue is that our detection is going to show up, the first detection where we're just looking at these 4769s with these special options, it's going to show us that Kerberoast honeypot service is requested. Or if we just have the 4769s that include the honeypot going to our SIM and having that alert set up, we can have some really high fidelity on what's going on here. So this can be done. In a recent SpectreOps webcast, they actually recommended to only use accounts that were created that have service principal names when doing red teaming or something like that, that were created prior to January 2017, which is when I published this information. So that's kind of interesting, this kind of cat and mouse between red and blue, which can be fun. So mitigating Kerberoasting, ultimately it comes down to limiting service count rights to only those required. I'm going to sound like a broken record, if you know what a record is, because this is something I say all the time, is very important. Ensuring these service counts have passwords of at least 20 characters, preferably greater than 25. This gives you time. So the concept behind this is a 20-character password or a 25-character password is going to be very difficult to crack, even with password theory, hybrid cracking, assuming that there's some randomization occurring in that password somewhere. A couple of random characters put together, some mix of different things in there, and not just a few words put together like battery horse staple or battery staple horse, one of those. Because the more complexity, the more randomization you put into it, the more difficult it is to actually crack that, especially at 20 characters or more. So if your service counts don't change for 5 or 10 years, the attacker has 5 or 10 years or more to attempt to guess that password that's 15 characters or 12 characters or 17 characters. So you want to make sure that you have time. If you're enforcing service count passwords that have to change every couple of years, and you know for certain that they're all changing and they all have to be 17 characters, great, go with that. But what you're buying is time with these longer passwords. Leverage group managed service counts so you don't have to change the passwords. They happen automatically. That password changes happen automatically, and that password is going to be long and complex and completely random. Make sure that these service counts can't log on interactively, and definitely use a honeypot account. Kerberoast delegation. Kerberoast delegation is something that has to be set up and configured because of the Kerberoast double hop issue. This is where a user logs into a web server. That web server is going to update a backend database, And without Kerberos delegation, that web server can't create any writes or perform any writes on that backend database server as a user. So with Kerberos delegation, that web server can impersonate that user, and then that user can effectively make those writes on the database server. So the web server will authenticate to the database server as a user. Those writes will occur there. So like I said, it is impersonation. These are the main types of delegation you'll see in your environment. The first one I want to focus on is unconstrained. This allows the account that is configured with unconstrained delegation to impersonate users connected to any service on any Kerberos service anywhere in the environment, any server, anywhere. This includes domain controllers. As I mentioned before with the vulnerability scanning account, if you have unconstrained delegation in your environment, that vulnerability scanning account or any kind of scanning account, including an inventory account that's a member of domain admins or something like that, with unconstrained delegation, that Kerberos TGT proof of identity is going to be left behind on that system. It's going to go into memory because of how delegation works. Constrained is somewhat less risky because it only allows impersonation of these users that have to be authenticated to the service on a specific service on servers. And then with constrained with protocol transition is very interesting because it's constrained to these specific services on servers, but the account that is configured with constrained with protocol transition, they can just ask the domain controller for delegated tickets and say that they need them. So I call this Kerberos magic because it just kind of appears the tickets, creates them out of nothing. And then the last one, resource-based constrained delegation, which is a little more complicated. This delegation is configured on the resource itself instead of the account. So Microsoft came up with this as a way to have better control from the resource itself, like that backend SQL server, to control who can delegate to it. But there's some interesting attacks that can come through that as well. So very busy slide, but here's a way to discover some of the most popular Kerberos delegation that's out there. The slides will be available. And in our next session in June, I will actually provide this command in text format in a script so you can check delegation in your environment. And I believe I've tweeted out the text as well. The challenge with constrained delegation, as you can see in this middle part, is that you have to know what services on which servers are associated with this delegation. With unconstrained, you check this one radio box, you click OK, and you're done. So that's why unconstrained happens a lot. We see that in environments that have delegation, which is probably 95, 99% of the environments we assess have Kerberos delegation. In those, I'd say that probably 90%, better than 90% of the accounts that have Kerberos delegation configured are configured as unconstrained. And again, that's a dangerous configuration. So mitigation, set all AD admin accounts to account is sensitive and cannot be delegated. This will protect those accounts from Kerberos delegation attacks for the most part. Convert these unconstrained delegation accounts to constrained, and then best over time, move all your AD admin accounts to protected users group once it's there. Windows 2012 R2 on the DC side will create that and have that available once you have that on as a PDC. And you want to make sure that you convert these, you get rid of any accounts that don't need delegation. So DC security, we want to make sure that you have domain controllers configured appropriately. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because I think they're pretty straightforward. Make sure your auditing is set correctly. Advanced auditing is the way to go. Standard auditing is the older method. And if you don't have this last thing checked, you're only getting standard auditing. You want to make sure that any GPOs linked to the domain or the domain controllers level, that only domain admins have modify rights. Anyone that created these group policies keep modify rights. And so this could be an escalation path for somebody or for the environment. You want to make sure that you don't link server GPOs to domain controllers. Keep these domain controllers GPOs unique and separate from others. Because you could have a situation where a restricted group is adding server admins to the built-in administrators group. And once this runs on the domain controller, server admins is then added to the domain administrators group, which is not what you want to do. So you definitely want to make sure that you use GPOs dedicated to DCs and not relink existing GPOs for this and other reasons. We don't want unintended consequences occurring on our DCs. User rights assignments, oftentimes we find that domain, I'd say 10% of the time we found that domain users is actually added to this for some reason. And this can be a problem because local access is relative. There's VMware, there's ILO. And Airbus Security has identified a number of ILO security issues over the years. This is on the HP platform, originally on the compact server platform. A number of them. RCEs, being able to pull RAM directly from the physical server. So this is a problem if you have DCs that are running on physical server and ILO is configured or not, because they figured out how, even if it's set to disable, to use it. ILO really needs to be on a separate network, out-of-band network, but realistically, this means we have to patch servers, physical servers that have security issues. And so from an admin security perspective, we need to make sure that regular users, regular workstations are not used for AD administration, because ultimately, when you have one workstation, there are a number of accounts that end up having effective admin rights on it. And then GPOs that apply to that, and people have modified rights to those. So the problem with using regular workstations for AD administration, even if you're using RDP and you're just going to RDP to your DC with admin rights, because with all these accounts that have privileged rights on your system, you may end up in a situation where you get this random file that shows up on your C drive after you've RDP'd, because there could be a WMI scheduled task configured that is looking for anytime you run mstsc.exe, which is the RDP client, which runs this weird script that actually is running this power split function called gets keystrokes. And then this weird file that was on the C drive ends up with all of these different things showing up, which is actually key logging your username and password. And even if the username is stored in the RDP session, we can correlate, we can do some screenshots as part of that to correlate the password with the actual account. But we use smart cards, so there is no real password, so we're good, right? Not really, because Windows caches that PIN that you type in. So as long as that smart card is actually inserted into the computer, an attacker could leverage that smart card credential because the PIN is already there. It could be extracted or captured with Mimikatz. And if you're using admin systems that are shared and all of the admins that connect to it have admin rights, a compromise of a single admin account could mean that they could leverage that admin right, get system. In this example, Alexander is using sticky keys to show how to hit shift several times, 5 times on the login window in order to get a command prompt that is running a system, and then run tscon.exe, and then they can connect to any session they want to. So they can jump into an RDP session. So you want to make sure if you're using admin servers or jump servers that the people that are connected to them do not have admin rights. And then with cloud integration, there's some concerns. Azure AD Connect, the default rights with express permissions, provides the rights for password sync. Well, that's what Azure AD Connect does. I talked about this at DEF CON and some of the other events, because Azure AD Connect, these two rights are what's needed for DC sync through Mimikatz to pull password hashes, but that's pretty much what Azure AD Connect does. Because about every 2 minutes, the Azure AD Connect server requests these stored password hashes from a DC. And then it runs them through a hash function and then uploads that hash of a hash effectively to Azure AD as part of password hash sync, which is a great thing to do. And I'll talk about that in 2 weeks at my next webcast on Azure Active Directory and Office 365. But there's another thing called Azure AD Seamless Single Sign-On. And Michael over at DS Eternal has published this post a couple years ago where there's potentially an issue with this. Azure AD Seamless Single Sign-On provides this transition from Azure AD authentication to the on-prem application access. So it effectively converts this Azure AD auth into a Kerberoast ticket. And so that way you can connect into the on-prem environment and still access applications. This leverages a specific and unique Azure AD SSO computer account in the on-prem AD, and it's used, again, to get these tickets in AD on behalf of the Azure AD users. But if attacker gains access to the computer account password, they can impersonate the users. So this is kind of like a mini KRBTGT. The key mitigation that Michael highlights here is to run update Azure SSO forest command at least 2 times a year. Because again, this is a computer account and stores the current and the previous password. So that's very important to do. Microsoft also says change this every 6 months. So recommendations about Azure AD Connect: protect like a domain controller, especially when it has these highly privileged rights. You want to firewall it off the network. It only needs to connect to Azure AD and domain controllers. Only your AD admins should be allowed to log on or administer it. Lock down the service account capability, monitor it. Keep account operators empty, because there is a security issue that was published by Microsoft a couple of years ago about account operators being able to modify this Azure AD Connect account. And then in the slides, I have some securing Active Directory phases here. I'm not going to go through this in the webcast, but it's in the slides. Level 1, things to do now or soon. Level 2, things to work on. Level 3, working on administration, and then some advanced methods of protecting administration, and then some additional mitigations and tools that you can use. But ultimately, the conclusion is that attackers will continue to exploit Active Directory as long as it's an easy target. This security posture can be greatly improved. We must evolve how we're doing things to protect AD, focusing on removing the accounts and service accounts from AD privilege groups and protecting and isolating AD admin credentials, which is the most critical. So that's been my webcast time for my presentation. We're going to switch to Q&A, and I know we're almost up at 2 o'clock here, but I will probably spend the next 15 minutes or so answering the questions that are highlighted. Again, this presentation slides and recording will be on trimarc.co/security webcast, which is linked at the bottom here. And our next webcasts are up there. So I'm going to take a look here at the questions and start working through these. So let's see. Question number 1: do you need to block changes? Do you need to block change DNS server on workstations for avoiding DNS tunneling? Please. That's a great question. So my recommendation would be that there's no reason for anyone inside a corporate network to access DNS servers outside of your corporate network. There's several reasons for doing this. It's going to be a little more challenging with Chrome supporting DNS over HTTPS and Chrome doing its own thing, but I believe there's some control switches and knobs you can do around that. But yes, absolutely you should block port 53 and any other DNS ports like the SSL one on your corporate network. Force them through your DNS servers. You can get a lot of insight into attack activity by forcing DNS traffic through your DNS servers and monitoring the logs. What's your recommendations and tools about MFA for RDP? The tools that we've seen used the most frequently and the most successfully is Duo. It's easy to use, deploy, but there are some concerns about MFA and some ways around it. Definitely check out on the trimarcsecurity.com website. I have a presentations page. Look at the DerbyCon or Black Hat presentation on from workstation to domain admin, and I talk about the ways around a lot of the common methods for performing administration. So even with MFA on that RDP session, if the attacker is on the system, much like I showed you here, and can capture that credential, the account, and the password, they can connect directly to the LDAP service on the domain controller. They don't need to MFA because MFA is only on the RDP session. But if you build a situation where the admins can only use their accounts in certain places, they're well isolated, they're using admin workstations, they only connect into admin servers, yeah, absolutely use MFA because that's a stronger thing around that situation to provide some benefits. And there's a note here, Microsoft 365 Business Premium now includes all Azure Premium P1 features. That's great. That means that Azure AD password protection will be included for those customers. And thank you, Scott, for providing the link. What about Have I Been Pwned API for bad password detection and integration for free? Great question. So I think there's a couple of open source, or at least I've seen a couple of open source password filters that have been published on GitHub and other places. There are a couple of corporate or companies that are providing password filters and capability around this that I've seen as well. My biggest concern is that any password filter and configuration is interacting with LSAS on your domain controllers. This can be a tricky thing to do, and if your domain controllers go down, it's probably going to be because of an LSAS issue, or at least from what I've seen, or poorly coded configuration. So you definitely could do it for free, but there's a balance between what's free and what has been optimized for large environments. So yes, there's a cost with the Microsoft solution or even a third-party solution, but these have been tested in various size environments. I am aware of a couple of very large enterprises that are using Azure AD password protection, at least in audit mode. A couple have switched over to protect mode. But yes, that could be an option of Have I Been Pwned API for the bad password detection and prevention, especially when connected with one of the open source password filter configurations. I'm not familiar with those and I've never tested them, so buyer beware, so to speak. Let's see. So when auditing ACLs in a large organization, what approach would you take in terms of what to prioritize or begin with? Great question. I would say start first with domain permissions. So at the domain root, look at GPO permissions as number 2. Number 3, look at admin, the admin SD holder permission. Excuse me. Those would be the priority ones. And if you tune in with us on June 17th, I'll be talking about exactly what to look at, the PowerShell commands that you can run, what to look for as far as what you could expect or what problematic configurations you may see there. Yeah, that would be my approach. With the Active Directory security assessments that we do at Trimarc, we have a very systematic approach to capturing this data. We have some automatic analysis that we have baked into our assessment tool, as well as a process by which we go and look at the permissions manually in addition to see if we can find any kind of combination that would be unusual, map that out, and then actually provide guidance around what groups have what combinations of rights. So from group membership to permissions on the domain, the OUs, the group policies, what group policies actually add that group to the different systems in OUs and things like that. Many thanks, Sean. Very informative session. Thank you. Will there be Trimarc online training? Great question. So Jared Haight and I did a DerbyCon training session the past 3 years. DerbyCon retired and is not performing any more conferences. Jared and I took that Windows security attack and defense training. We have been working to convert it to be an enterprise security training, which includes Active Directory security topics and kind of merge things together. We have done a version of this already in February. The problem is that right now it is very much an on-site offering. So we were going to launch an on-site offering training option this year, but the world has kind of changed a little bit. So look for an announcement in next year. Unfortunately, at this time, we have not figured out how to do something like that virtually. We may check and we may see if that changes, but you can monitor my Twitter, Trimarc, at Trimarc Security, so Trimarc's Twitter, and see if anything around that changes. Let's see, is Mimikatz blocked with Credential Guard enabled? Great question. So Mimikatz is not blocked by many things. Note that it's more about the behavior of the tool and not so much the tool. Credential Guard does not block Mimikatz, but it prevents Mimikatz from pulling some of the credential secrets you might expect. But there are limitations to Credential Guard. Credential Guard doesn't protect local accounts, it doesn't protect Microsoft accounts. You cannot use it with the Active Directory database. And service counts are not in Credential Guard. So service counts are getting loaded into LSAS memory as well. There are some others that are some limitations as well. So based on what I've seen with Credential Guard, it is a great idea to enable it because it's going to protect certain types. It's going to protect like the KRBTGT credential and some of the e-keys associated with getting that Kerberos ticket. But service tickets are still going to be in the user's memory space. It's not going to prevent the attacker from popping something up, a logon prompt or box for the user to type in something. It's not going to prevent something like Responder being run on the network that's going to capture NT password hashes. Let's see, do we need to rotate the KRBTGT password on the latest Windows Server editions? Looks like Demetrius already answered that. Yes, so even on Server 2019, you still need to do rotation. Microsoft is very careful about changing default behavior. So to my knowledge, they are not making any changes to that. You will still need to perform your own rotation of the KRBTGT. I've heard anecdotally that an organization is doing it every day. We don't necessarily recommend that. Changing it twice a year is fine. Every few months between it will mitigate most of the risk with the issue. But you should be fine with changing it. Note that 2019 does actually automatically rotate the password when you have enabled smart card authentication on accounts. This was new. Prior to 2019 DCs, you'd have to automatically flip a bit and unflip it in order to, the actual smart card authentication, turn it off and then turn it back on again in order for the AD to rotate that password or build a new password hash associated with it. So let's see, what other mitigations you recommend for a user having generic right, full control basically on a GPO? For example, if the GPO is linked to an OU, which is linked to another computer or DC. So Um, Based on the question, the obvious answer is that users shouldn't have any kind of modify rights to a GPO. There is a a creator owner ACL on the GPO policy object, so that gets inherited. So when someone creates a group policy, they automatically get modify rights on it. So this is one of the challenges with organizations when they have an AD environment where users were originally admins. So you had user accounts that were domain admins, and then over time you remove them from domain admins. They had a secondary admin account, like an ADM or admin, for their management of Active Directory. But those user accounts have created OUs, they've created group policies, they've promoted domain controllers. So oftentimes we find what I call the archaeology of Active Directory, where we find artifacts of these things. And when we do AD security assessments, we provide recommendations around that, how to clean those things up. So yeah, my recommendation would be to remove the user unless there's a really good reason for them to have the ability to edit it. If that's the case, make sure that that OU is set to the, or that GPO is set to a specific OU. Do some security filtering so it only applies to a specific computer, and then I would document the heck out of that thing so people knew how it was configured, but ideally remove them. What is your recommendation about local administrator account on servers and workstations? Disable default administrator account because of SID and create a new domain account which will be a member of the local administrator groups, or enable and use the default administrator account. In both scenarios, we will use LAPS. So the old recommendation, or older recommendation prior to LAPS in Windows 10, was to disable the RID 500 account, which is that default administrator account, because you can still log on, you can boot up in safe mode, still log on with it, even if it's disabled. Or you can still use it necessarily if you need to, but you disable it so that way its capability, like no lockout and things like that, are mitigated. That's shifted because LAPS can only manage one local account. So we recommend that you only have one local account that's a member of the local administrators group, which is your RID 500 account. Use LAPS to manage it. Even if you're going to disable it, we still recommend that you have LAPS change the password. One of the common techniques for attackers is to create a new local account, add it to the local administrators group so they have kind of a backdoor account. So you can also control the local administrators group through group policy, which is another good recommendation. So that way people aren't creating additional accounts. Some of the most challenging environments we've seen is where they have LAPS to manage the RID 500 account, which is enabled, but then there's 2 or 3 organizational local admin accounts that are also being used. That's a great scenario where you shift people over to using LAPS in order to manage it. There are ways to audit when someone has viewed the LAPS password, so you could actually probably put together some sort of workflow around that through PowerShell scripting or similar. Let's see, to avoid managing credentials on domain clients, I prefer to run tasks on a system and give them domain computers read access to any network resources involved. Is there anything wrong, insecure about running scheduled tasks as system? I don't necessarily think that there is. There's probably some more thinking I should do about that. I'd say the off-the-cuff answer is that none that I can immediately think of, but I'm sure after this webcast, someone will say, actually, Sean, there was this other thing. So ideally, you'd use some limited capability, like maybe network service or something like that. But no, on the face of it, I don't see anything directly wrong about going that route. Let's see. The next one. Do you have any tutorials on proper AD delegation? Good question. I do not off the top of my head. We will make a note of that and see if we have a resource for that for our next Securing Active Directory webcast on June 17th. How to avoid storing of admin credentials embedded in scripts on shared folders, e.g. to include the credentials dynamically. Can LAPS help with this problem? Oh, so storing admin credentials. Yeah, that's a concern, and that could be a big challenge where credentials are hard-coded into a script and then have to be pulled. Now, realistically, unless you roll your own, which is going to take time and energy and support, so your own supportability, if you're doing it or if you hire someone else to do it, this is one of the scenarios where Purchasing a Passwrd Vault solution can provide the capability of that, because they, I believe CyberArk, as well as Thycotic Secret Server, has the capability for API calls against the vault to get the credential to be used for a script or a program. So I'm not sure. You could potentially have, again, roll your own where it has rights to view the lapsed password, can programmatically reach out to the attribute that stores the lapsed password on that computer account, uses that as the password for that runtime, then at the end reaches out and clears the expiration time value, where lapse will then automatically rotate it. That would probably be the best way to do it. Let's see, are there attacks aimed to bypass Credential Guard? The ones that I'm aware of to bypass Credential Guard have to go against the Hyper-V hypervisor, because once you enable Credential Guard, the Hyper-V hypervisor is shimmed in between the hardware level itself and Windows 10, the OS itself. Windows 10 becomes a VM on that hypervisor. And then there's a new microkernel OS that's spun up called Secure World, or Microsoft has several words for it. But that's where Credential Guard, the process itself that stores the secrets, it actually lives. So at that point, you have to go after the hypervisor or the hardware itself. I'm aware of a couple pretty extreme ways to go after that. I'm not aware of any obvious, easy way to get to go after it. So there are, but it really comes down to protecting the UEFI BIOS configuration, and locking down the system, making secure boot, make sure secure boot, trusted boot, and the other security components of the system boot up process are enabled. You can also help protect that by using something like BitLocker, especially if physical security of the device, like a mobile laptop, is not 100% protected, using the TPM chip, or preferably TPM plus PIN. So let's see. Many thanks, Sean. Very informative session. Thank you. Or I might have read that already. I apologize. Okay, best tools to use for auditing AD and blue team perspective in case AD gets compromised. Wow, that's a big one. I think I'm going to have to probably do an entire webcast on that. So we're going to make a note of that. Best tools used for auditing AD. As far as for auditing AD to check it, the best tools right now are going to be Bloodhound, Ping Castle. It's PING castle.com. Talk about some of that in our next Securing Active Directory session in June. But yeah, that's a big question. For AD getting compromised, it's unless you see some really weird things and things changing and you're getting locked out, or other things that are showing up. If you're seeing something weird, or if you get a hit on, say, Mimikatz has been run on a domain controller, you definitely want to reach out to one of the incident response companies and have a compromise analysis performed. CrowdStrike, who we partner with, or Mandiant FireEye, or one of the others that are known for doing incident response or compromise analysis. What does Kerberos armoring provide in defense to attacks? I've read docs, but never got a great answer on whether we should have that implemented. Kerberos armoring, or FAST, is a prerequisite for things like, and actually I'm trying to delve into my memory to pull this. So Kerberos armoring, or FAST, is used for authentication policies and policy silos, and I believe there might have been one other component that it was a part of. You probably have never heard me talk about authentication policies and policy silos before. There's a good reason for it. They're very complicated and they take time to do. I don't have a good answer for this, Zach. I will follow up with this on Twitter. I apologize. I can't think of a good answer on this. We will make a note of this question, and I will put something out there. Let you know one way or the other if I found something or not. Kerberoasting, would disabling the RC4 Kerberos encryption type in all domain controllers stop this type of attack from working? No. Or would TGS service tickets using AES encryption also be vulnerable? So to all of the password cracking tools, Kerberos AES has been added. But AES takes exponentially more time to check per instance than RC4 does. So it takes a lot longer, but it's still possible with AES. It just takes incredibly long time to go through and check each one, where RC4 is very fast. It was developed for low power, low processor capability systems, and it's an older method, so it's a lot slower. AES actually has some components built into it to slow down brute forcing over time. But yeah, I mean, you can set the service count and say prefer AES 128, prefer AES 256. But that's just going to stop a script kiddie effectively, someone that's just using this quick and easy PowerShell method. You can actually request RC4 still, even if you say prefer AES. So there's not a good answer around that. Are there any impacts while we're setting the KRBTGT password periodically in case of backup restore? Yes. So one of the things that Christoph Kaderna has posted on Twitter is that you can have issues doing an authoritative restore of a domain controller after changing the KRBTGT with a backup prior to that. So that is a known issue, or at least one that is known of. Other than that, there should be no issues with other types of objects, your standard 80 backup restore of like groups or OUs or things like that. So just keep in mind when you change your KRBTGT, you want to run a full system state backup on at least all your FSMOs in your Active Directory environment, your Active Directory forest. And once you've done that full backup of all your FSMOs, then you can save those, make a mark of those or a note of those, and that is the one to use moving forward or anything beyond that. So let's see, I think I got, do you see selective authentication being a useful control to prevent reconnaissance and privilege escalation techniques of compromised accounts? So yes, selective auth is a way to change the typical everyone can see everything over a trust for an Active Directory. So looking across a trust, you only have access to what you're explicitly allowed to access, which means you can't see everything in AD, in the AD environment. You can't see everything, but it's tricky to set up. I've done this once before in a lab, and it takes time to say this group should have access to these resources. So you have to map that out really well. But yes, it's the best way. If you're going to use trusts, especially between two AD forests or domains of different security levels, it's a great way to limit potential attacker capability across that. What are the most common attacks and privilege escalation paths you see against Azure AD nowadays? Well, join me in 2 weeks on May 27th, and I will talk about that specifically. And you can register for that at trimarc.co/security webcast. Let's see, is there any tool for managing honeypot accounts? If so, do you have any recommendations? Thanks. I'm not certain about specific accounts, like I mentioned here for the Kerberoasting honeypot, but I would highly recommend Think's Canary as a wonderful honeypot device, which can be deployed anywhere in your environment. They have virtual devices, they have physical devices. They're very reasonably priced, and they can emulate just about any type of system. They also have if you go to Think's Canary, they have their honey tokens, which can be, you can create documents that reach back to an Amazon link that will then let you know at your email address if someone's opened it. So you can drop a bunch of those in shares to see if people are looking at stuff like financial files or passwords.txt to see if someone is interested in looking at things. You get what IP they're coming from, what system they're on, things like that is very interesting. But beyond that itself, I'm not aware of managing the honeypot account specifically. So let me see if are there any others that I missed here. And Scott or Demetrius, just jump in if I missed one and you're aware of it. I'm changing my sort to see what we find here. Okay, does using PSExec to manage systems remotely expose administrative credentials over the wire? Reviewing security audits on these tools are in use show that NTLM v1 authentication is being used. I am not specifically aware of what PSExec uses, but if that's what you're seeing, then that's probably what's happening. I'm sure there are others that have looked at this in more depth and are aware of PSExec exposing credential or how it's used. If I do find this, I will post it on Twitter later today or in the near future. How can we mitigate Active Directory DNS record wildcard attack? That is a great question, and I believe Kevin Robertson has published a blog article on that. I believe the initial mitigation is to pre-create it, but I don't have a good answer beyond what Kevin's research is. He's definitely the authority on that. He's also a very nice and very humble person. So let's see, I think I've gotten all of them. Okay, I don't see any more questions. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. I know we went a little bit over, so I'll account for that in future sessions. But I really appreciate everyone joining. Thanks very much for tuning in. And we will have a Trimarc webcast. We're planning on doing this about once a month. And we have two different series. One's going to be on securing Office 365 and Azure Active Directory, and the other is on securing Active Directory itself. We may have others thrown in as content is available. But you can register for those on this link, trimarc.co/security-webcasts, and we will also provide the slides and the recording in the next couple of days. So I've been Sean. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Take care.